Happy New Year, and for victims and villains, my name is Josh, and today is going to be the first of 3 videos that are going to explore the good and the bad from this past year in 2024, and what movies I'm most anticipated on coming into this new year of 2025. Now, this list is going to be the top 10 worst movies of 2025. I'll throw a couple honorable mentions as we get closer to the worst of the worst. At number 10, we have Hellboy The Crooked Man. I'm not gonna lie, I had high hopes for this movie, given the fact that Mike Mignola, who is the creator of Hellboy, involved in not only the story process, but also the screenwriting process as well, and it's based off a story that he wrote, which I believe is the first time that we've ever actually seen that from a Hellboy adaptation. That said, I just kind of felt like this movie was really boring. Like, I don't know how you take something as exciting as Hellboy and something this intimate and just kind of create something this lackluster. I will say this version of Hellboy, I will give the actor playing the part props, but the rest of this movie just kind of felt like it was really predictable, really generic, and when you have a studio that picks up this, it does this big presentation at San Diego Comic-Con, really builds the hype for it, and then does nothing with that hype, not even releasing it in theaters, but straight direct to streaming, and not even like direct to streaming, but video on demand. That's got to speak volumes about the quality of this film and really how you see it. I know that for this film, it was either you really love it or you really hate it, and I just was not part of the people that this really jived with. At number 9, I have Imaginary. I know Jeff Wadlow is often criticized for a lot of his genre pictures. I, for one, really enjoyed and had a blast with Fantasy Island, so this being his follow-up to it, I was really intrigued by where he was going to go. And this movie just feels like really forgettable. Like, I probably couldn't tell you anything about this movie outside of its third act, and that's because the third act for this was just absolutely insane. Probably the most redeemable thing about this movie, but I had to go back and look at my notes for this movie to even remember it and why it was on my list. But this movie was forgettable, it was boring, and honestly, it just wasn't scary. At number 8, I have Crisis on Infinite Earths Part 2. Now, this was a trilogy that came out chronicling the iconic DC storyline in animated form. I really loved the first and third ones, but this one just kind of felt like such a filler entry. And I get that it's probably not fair that it's on this list because it was essentially a development piece, but I spent an hour and a half bored out of my mind with this one. The animation is stunning, voice acting is okay, but largely this just feels like a filler film where you essentially could have done Crisis on Infinite Earths in Part 1 and Part 2, similarly to the way that they did Watchmen, which is on another list that'll be on here in a few days. Number 7, Night Swim. Note to James Wan and Jason Blum, if you are announcing a monster, monumental collaboration of your 2 brands coming together under one umbrella, do not make a movie this crappy your gateway into that intro announcement. This movie came out on the heels of Atomic Monster and Blumhouse kind of unifying and coming together under a new banner that I don't even remember the name for it. However, this movie was released in January. It feels like a January, and it feels like it belongs on this list. This movie was slow, sluggish, predictable, and just overflowing with bad writing, bad acting, and a story that probably could have been more effective if told in a short film format. Speaking of January, at number 6, we have Founders Day. Back in the 80s, it was all the rage to name a horror movie after a holiday, whether you're talking about Friday the 13th, Halloween, April Fool's Day. That list goes on and on and on. And so surely we should have one about a small town holiday called Founders Day. Imagine the most generic movie that you can think of in terms of horror, all of hitting every single stereotype and cliche of the slasher subgenre, and you have Founders Day. This movie felt like it was riding on the coattails and success of Eli Roth's Thanksgiving, which we just did an episode about on Abyss Gazing, so you should check it out and hear us gush about it and what we're thankful for. So hit the link in the show notes below. And much like the success of Halloween, you had copycats that came out in the 80s, as well as Friday the 13th ushered in this whole slew of copycats that just kind of came along. And so it feels like this is just a copycat response to the success of Thanksgiving, and it just felt like it just was tossed together in a blender, creating one of the worst horror movies of this year. At number 5, we have young blondes stalked and murdered. Throughout the year, between Abyss Gazing and regular content over at Victims and Villains, we have the pleasure of covering a number of film festivals, and this one came to us from Salem Horror Fest, which we covered in April. Check out the links in the show notes below for the full episode. And it's kind of inevitable that one of those film festival films finds its way on this list. Typically, I have at least one film a year that I think sounds really awesome. When it's on paper, actually writing the review for it and sitting down watching it is a completely different experience. And oftentimes, fortunately, it finds themselves on this list at typically within the top 5, unfortunately. Elle Chapman plays our lead actress, and she does a phenomenal job. She is literally the only redeeming thing about this movie. It does look great, but it is one of those movies that is style over substance. There's no character development. It has a predictable ending, and even at 65 minutes, this film felt like it was being tortured for 2 hours. And while we're on the topic of film festivals, let's throw another one out to you guys. Coming to us from the Fantasia Film Festival, at number 4, I have Me and My Victim. This movie was more frustrating than anything else. It has an outstanding cinematography quality to it, and it looks truly breathtaking and just absolutely stunning. But this movie literally could have been a short film or a film that was closer in the length to Young Blondes. This film has little to no structure, and that is literally just the tip of the iceberg of issues that I had with this film. Go check out our Fantasia episode to hear my full thoughts. At number 3, we have the film Werewolves, sadly. How do you take a concept that is essentially The Purge with werewolves and make it boring is literally one of the greatest mysteries that I've encountered in 2024. And going even further with that Purge feel and vibe to it, you cast Frank Grillo, the guy that was in 2 out of 5, and 2 of probably the best films in the franchise, to lead this role, and you still managed to somehow put me to sleep. This movie does have an incredible throwback vibe to it with its practical effects. I will say the climax of this movie, best part of it, it's an exceptional showcase of practical effects and just what this film was really capable of doing. But it is a very large, monumental chore to arrive there. Now, that's not to say that you don't see the special effects throughout the course of this film. Practical effects are littered throughout the entire thing, and they are the only reason that I would ever recommend checking this movie out. But other than that, everything else is just a slugfest. At number 2, we have Devin. Honestly, if I can just say to JWoww, Jenny Farley, please stick to reality television. This movie was only 75 minutes and was such a struggle to get through. Now, over the years of doing film critique, I have established that I am not the largest fan of found footage films. Most found footage films either end up just being really terrible or I'm really neutral on them. This one was just such a pain to get through. Found footage is literally one of the only genres that I think it's acceptable for actors to have a lot of an experience, really kind of not sell the audience on them being actors. I feel like it makes it a lot more genuine. And this one just feels really too polished. It feels like it misses the point of what it means to be a found footage film. And the the finale to this film that should have been the chef's kiss to everything we were building up was just completely stupid and just pointless. Now, I did say before I got to my number one, I would give a few honorable mentions that very close to making this list, and here they are. Back to Black. This should have been a surefire, emotional, moving biopic on Amy Winehouse, and this movie was anything but. This movie treats Winehouse's story very similarly to how Bohemian Rhapsody kind of sanitized Freddie Mercury's story. It does, this one in particular, it doesn't necessarily feel like that sanitation factor, but it does definitely feel like it's got that like choppy, it misses out on that raw film that the A24 documentary Amy captures so perfectly. And if you are interested in more about Amy Winehouse, please go check out Amy, the A24 documentary, and completely skip this one if you haven't already. Next up, you have The Watchers, which is an okay movie. It sits outside here for a reason. They clung to close to the legacy of M. Night Shyamalan having to get the big twist, and this big twist was really predictable. It's bloated runtime, and it's fine. It's fine, but it's closer to this list than just me being neutral. My last honorable mention is going to go to Skincare. The story that inspired this movie is bananas. Elizabeth Banks is really solid in this movie, but it never rises to the insanity that this story should have had. And kind of like Back to Black, this film feels like it's telling the true life counterpart with kid gloves on. And I just kind of felt like this felt like a modern generic version of Single White Female rather than the captivating true story that this film inspired. And at number one, it should go without saying, but it's got to go to Borderlands from Eli Roth. Eli Roth is one of those directors that I will always, and I mean always, check out anything this man does, because the majority of things that he does I've enjoyed whether he has done family-friendly films like The House with the Clock in Its Walls, or just downright gross movies like Cabin Fever or Green Inferno. And so I was kind of curious to see what he was going to do with the world of Borderlands. Now, I say that with no frame of reference to the video games. I'm not a gamer by any means, but this cast, the director, everything had me curious, and man, I really wish I would have ignored that curiosity, because this was incredibly painful to sit through. I'm one of the very few people that did kind of like Jack Black in this role as Claptrap. I thought that he was kind of funny, but it's not one of his better comedic roles. But everything from Cate Blanchett to being horribly miscast to Jamie Lee Curtis also being just strangely in this. Kevin Hart felt like a weird choice in this movie as well. There's so many weird miscastings in this, and I think a lot of the behind the scenes drama really did affect the final product, because it just feels messy and mismanaged, and you can definitely tell that there are two different voices telling the story that have no cohesion whatsoever. And this film just feels like it's a generic ripoff of the Guardians of the Galaxy story that we saw 10 years ago. The CGI is bad, and there's just literally nothing redeemable about this movie. Alright, so that is it. There you have it. Top 10 worst movies of 2024. In my opinion,